This is a bit of a tough nut to crack. I keep seeing 1914, Jehovah's Witnesses, failed prophecy. It's the central part of their dogma. If that's all wrong, then Jehovah's Witnesses are finished. Or they're going to drop the doctrine. So, it starts with the disciples asking Jesus when he will return again, doesn't it? In Matthew 24, he says there, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your presence or coming, and the conclusion of the system? Of course, their main concern was their own country, Israel, and of course he foretold the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. So this Watchtower study article was published in July 2014. Please note that if you have gone through material by Adventists or other people, so-called Christian theologians, and you're just repeating what they've said because they're telling you what Jehovah's Witnesses believe, and then they've got all the references, and then they put their arguments, and then you just repeat it, and then if this 2013 Watchtower is not referenced, everything else is out of date. Because I get people contact me and they go, "Oh no, you don't believe that." And I thought, well, yes I do. Don't tell me what I believe and what I don't believe. I know what I believe. Don't tell me, but my organisation, Jehovah's Witnesses, teaches something different, because I know what it teaches. I go to the meetings every week. So anyway, verse 2, paragraph 2. It says, through the years, Jehovah's servants have prayerfully studied Jesus' prophecy about the last days. They have sought to get a clearer understanding of the timing of the fulfilment of Jesus' words. To illustrate this, the disciples asked when. When does the Great Tribulation begin? When does Jesus judge the sheep and the goats? And when does he arrive or come or is present? Because, of course, Jehovah's Witnesses teach that Jesus came invisibly in 1914, and, of course, they're mocked for it. So, let's ask the first question. When does the Great Tribulation begin? It says a number of years ago, we thought that the Great Tribulation began in 1914, and that by 1918 those days were cut short and the good news would continue for some period and conclude eventually at a future time at Armageddon. Paragraph 4. Upon further examination of Jesus' prophecy, however, we perceive that part of Jesus' prophecy about the last days has two fulfilments. Now that's not a surprise. The first fulfilment in the first century, so from 33 CE, when Jesus spoke about it, until 66, the last days of the Jewish system continued, and then something happened. Something happened that stood in the holy place, the political Roman army, and within 3.5 years from that point, Jerusalem was destroyed. But the Christians were told, weren't they, to get out. That's in Luke 21. It's also mentioned in Mark 13 as well. So it says here, it also says that we also discern that the first part of the Great Tribulation did not begin in 1914. In fact, now we know it's a future event. But it says why? Because there was a war, and there was no attack on religion. Religion being Jehovah's people, and false religion being what Jehovah's Witnesses call Babylon the Great. And this would begin the pangs of distress. And so, what will signal the start of the Great Tribulation? It says here, quoting from Matthew 24, when you catch sight of the disgusting thing that causes desolation, spoken by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, flee to the mountains. So that's what they did. So it's got to be something very much the same today, hasn't it? So it's the disgusting thing today, we believe, is the United Nations. Bear in mind that Gog of Magog will be involved, and there is a short time when there's an eighth king. So when the eighth king comes into play, with the blessing of the United Nations, or it's the United Nations, then he will attack not just false religion, but Jehovah's people as well. And then the days are cut short. Jehovah cuts the days short to save his people. We know that the days were cut short in 66 CE, when the Roman armies, after breaching the temple wall and stood in the disgusting place, fled away. So that was a political expression, wasn't it? So it allowed the true religion members to escape. After that, it says, we will witness Armageddon, the climax of the Great Tribulation, which parallels Jerusalem's destruction in 70 CE. And then it says here, consider now the timing of another part of Jesus' prophecy, because he talks about the sheep and the goats, and that Jesus judges the sheep and the goats. It says, previously we thought that the judging of the people as sheep and goats would take place during the entire period of the last days, from 1914 right up to Armageddon. We re-examined this, is paragraph 11, and we have come to establish that Jesus will only judge the sheep and the goats when he sits down on his glorious throne. So in 1914, Jesus arrived on his throne and began his rulership, but he hadn't sat down. When he sat down on his glorious throne, he sits down as the judge. And that is an event literally just before Armageddon. In fact, it says here, some say, oh, well, no, that whole prophecy only applies to Jerusalem. But in Matthew 25, it says that when he sits on his glorious throne, all the nations are gathered before him. So that is everybody. So it's a worldwide event. So it says here, Jesus' prophecy about the last days reveals that he will for the first time act as judge of all nations after the destruction of false religion. Have all come. So he arrived or came invisibly, and then he comes to judge. It says here, they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. You do not know what day your Lord is coming. At an hour you do not think it, the Son of Man is coming. In the parable of the sheep and goats, Jesus says the Son of Man arrives in his glory. So it says each of these four references applies to Christ's future coming as judge, when in Jesus' prophecy we find remaining four references. It says here, happy is the slave of his master on arriving, and finds him doing so. It says in the parable of the virgins, while they were going off to buy, the bridegroom arrived or came. In the parable of the talents, Jesus relates, after a long time the master of those slaves came. On my arrival, I would receive what is mine. What do the four instances of Jesus coming refer? In the past we thought it was in 1918, and also where Jesus appointed a faithful and discreet slave. We understood that arriving mentioned was linked to the time when Jesus came to inspect the spiritual condition of the anointed in 1918. However, under further consideration of Jesus' prophecy indicates there's an adjustment to our understanding of timing of certain aspects of Jesus' prophecy needed to be. It says here in Matthew chapter 24, verse 46, it says the coming refers consistently to the time when Jesus comes to promote and execute judgment during the Great Tribulation. This is a future event. So it's reasonable to conclude that Jesus' arrival to appoint the faithful slave over all his belongings applies as a future event. So the governing body is not claiming to be the faithful and discreet slave who's already been approved. It's a future event. They know they're a slave being used and they're working hard to be faithful. And in the future Watchtower it mentions that the slave was warned that he could become evil or have evil tendencies in a future Watchtower study, so that they must be on guard. It says, indeed, a consideration of Jesus' prophecy in its entirety makes it clear that each of these 8 references to his coming applies to a future time of judgment during the Great Tribulation. So it says here, in review, what have we learned? Paragraph 19. In the beginning of this article, we raised 3 when questions. We considered the Great Tribulation didn't start in 1914. It will start when the United Nations attacks Babylon the Great, or Gog, the 8th king, that's my addition, with the approval of the United Nations. Finally, we examine Jesus' arrival to appoint the faithful slave all over his belongings. It did not occur in 1919, but will take place during the Great Tribulation. So when the 3 whens apply to the same future time period, the Great Tribulation, how does this affect us? Well, it said look at the next article, so I'm going to try and do that if I can get enough time. Now, the next article, I'm going to cover this very briefly. It's talking about the wheat and the weeds growing since they were sown at Pentecost. So the Christian congregation, those who were serving Christ loyally, they were wheat. Eventually, though, weeds started to appear in the Christian congregation, and eventually they dominated the patch. Then we got to World War I in 1914. There was a small nucleus of wheat being gathered. Well, I think we might get to this in a moment, and they both grow together. It says, what about the larger fulfillment? Because it mentions about Jerusalem first. And Malachi's prophecy. During the decades leading up to 1914, C.T. Russell and his close associates did a work like that of John the Baptizer. That vital work involved restoring Bible truths. The Bible students taught the true meaning of Christ's ransom, exposed the hellfire lie, proclaimed the coming of the Gentile times, the ending of the Gentile times in 1914. There were numerous religious groups who claimed to be Christ's followers, so the crucial question needed to be answered: who among the groups were the wheat? To settle the question, Jesus began to inspect his spiritual temple in 1914. By 1919, he had selected a specific group. When he began his inspection, what did he find? A small group of zealous Bible students who for well over 30 years had given their strength and fortunes of a preaching campaign. Of course, in 1914, these students were shocked that they didn't go to heaven in 1914 because they believed Armageddon was coming here. There was trouble within the organisation. Then it says, as the collecting work progressed, the distinction between the two groups became clearer. By 1919, it became evident that Babylon the Great had fallen. What especially set the true Christians apart from the imitation ones? The imitation ones are Babylon the Great, or the churches of Christendom, the Roman Catholic Church and all the Christian churches, the Adventists, all of them. It was the preaching work that was taking place amongst the Bible students, and the stress of the importance of sharing personally the kingdom message. The gathering of the wheat, the anointing gathered. It says here, the gathering of the wheat goes on throughout that period of the time of the last days. And it says, for those anointed Christians who will be alive at the end of the system, the final gathering takes place when they receive their heavenly reward, just prior to the end of the Great Tribulation. By the wheat class, why it's of a vital importance to collect them, knowing who they are essential to finding the answer to the question raised by Jesus in his extensive prophecy about the last day, when he asked who really is the faithful and discreet slave. And then there's 2 more articles, so I shall cover them in another video. I think you've probably listened to me enough. So In clarification, Christians since the 1870s and 1880s did a pre-1914 harvest work that was like John the Baptist, and when Jesus arrived in 1914, he did not arrive to judge, he arrived to establish a slave that would do his will and gather in the anointed Christians that were still needed to come in. And eventually later it would be also the other sheep who would eventually have the hope of getting into the new world and gaining everlasting life. And that event would be a period of time leading up to when Jesus actually comes to judge, which we know is a future event. And that judgment period is likely to last the same amount of time as it did in 36 CE to 9, when the disgusting thing, the disgusting political thing, stands in the holy place. And that disgusting political thing could also stand in the holy place of Jehovah's Witnesses, because it attacks not just the world empire of false religion, but obviously the purpose of its attack is to attack Jehovah's people. And so they expect a persecution that would threaten their very existence. But it says Jehovah cuts short the days for the sake of saving them and bringing judgment upon the eighth king, backed up by the United Nations. So that's when Jesus actually comes to judge, and that's the time when all the eyes will see him. So Jehovah's Witnesses do teach that he came invisibly in 1914, but that's a prelude to his coming where all the eyes will see him. And most certainly, if you're an atheist, you're going to see the actions of Jesus when he brings Armageddon, without a doubt. In fact, it says in the prophecy, that I didn't read the paragraphs, people run and hide and try and hide from Jesus and the holy angels as they bring judgment and Armageddon upon the nations of the world, rebellious humanity. So there it is. So if you want to write a comment in the comments, do so. But if you're going to start referencing other things, you won't get any reply from me. I've got better things to do than listen to people spouting out from stuff that's been written 20 or 30 years ago by anti-Jehovah's Witness Protestants back then. Instead of spouting other people's writings, why don't you actually look into the scriptures yourself? And if you want to know about what we teach, ask us. Wherever you walk, you'll find us, knocking on your door, or we'll be by the cart. And try not to be like some of these people that walk up to you and they're surreptitiously doing a video to put it on the YouTube, and they're trying to set Jehovah's Witnesses up. We can see through you. We're trained. We're trained to do the preaching work as ministers of God. And remember, every single one who is preaching the good news is a minister of God. So it gives us a special privilege and responsibility because we're carrying God's holy name. Thank you very much. And presenting Jehovah's truth.